We're very lucky to have live with us back in the studios once again, Tim Harris. Tim Harris is founder and executive director of Real Change News, Seattle's homeless newspaper. Tim, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Always a joy.
All right. That sounded a little bit sarcastic there. Probably talking about the hour of the day.
I think you ought to get yourself a nice afternoon show.
I know. I'm working on it, dude. So start out, tell us, what is Real Change News? How did it come about?
Sure. Real Change is a weekly community newspaper, weekly progressive community newspaper. It's sold by about 300 homeless and very low-income people in the Seattle region. Every month. Last year we had more than 800 folks who sold the paper to be able to earn some money. Our mission is to provide opportunity and a voice to homeless and low-income people and to take action for economic justice. There's 3 programs. One is the vendor services, which helps all those folks that are selling the paper and gets them what they need to be successful. And then there, of course, is the newspaper itself. Last year, we won 11 first-place journalism awards from the Washington News Publishers Association and the Society of Professional Journalists. And then there is our activism, which, is a whole thing in itself, and that is about really connecting the survival issues that our vendors face and the growing economic vulnerability of the broad middle class and bringing people together to fight for the kind of economic justice that we all need.
And what specifically is Real Change Homeless Empowerment Project? Is that separate?
Real Change Homeless Empowerment Project is just our formal 501c3 name. Yeah.
Gotcha. And as we pointed out last time you were here, you put more than $1 million into the hands of those who are selling the paper?
Well, actually, that number has gone up rather dramatically because over this last year, we had the price increase, which has been really successful. The vendors were paying 35 cents for their copy of the paper and selling it on the street for $1, which let them pocket 65 cents. And this last year, we raised the cover price to $2, so now they pay 60 cents up front for their paper and pocket $1.40. And that was a pretty dramatic raise for our vendors, and it's worked out really well. The overall circulation has gone down by about 15%, but we're finding that most of that is because the vendors are just making more money selling the paper in less time, so they don't have to be out there selling quite as many papers to make the kind of money that they want to be making. So that's been very, very successful all around.
And also this last year, you expanded your operations into Bellevue. Can you talk about that?
Right, and also Bremerton. There are day centers in both Bremerton and Bellevue that are distributing the paper now, and we're doing orientations from those places and signing up people in those locations to sell the paper. And that's, starting out slow, but it's going to grow, and we're going to nurture it along, and we're hoping that is the beginning of further regional expansion.
So prior to starting Real Change here in Seattle, you had started a paper in the Boston area?
Boston, right. I moved here in 94 to start Real Change, but in 92 I was working as basically a grassroots direct action style organizer with homeless folks in Boston. I'd been doing that since the late 80s. And I was really struck by I had this value of homeless folks and very poor people being involved in economic justice activism and building leadership there. And I was really struck by how there's this long timeline, long uncertain horizon for social justice organizing, but very, very immediate and dire needs that very poor and homeless folks are experiencing, and that it was really hard for people to be involved in the kind of organizing that I was trying to get them involved in. They just didn't have the stability in their lives. And the street newspaper idea just struck me as a great solution, because it allowed people to meet their very immediate needs and give them the space for being involved in longer haul economic justice organizing. So that's been a really, really great organizing platform, I think, and also because it builds bridges between very poor people and middle class folks. And over the years, I've come to understand that those relationships that get built between vendors and readers on the street while they're selling the paper is at the core of our effectiveness as advocacy organization, and really about the vendors getting what they need.
And what inspired you to become a homeless activist in the first place?
That's an interesting question. There were a few turning points. When I was in college, I went to Washington, D.C., and I got arrested in support of Mitch Snyder when he was doing his 42-day fast, where he almost died. And that was a very moving experience that stuck with me. When I was younger, I was a teenage runaway and had some rough times, was on the street for a little while, lived in Sioux Falls' version of Skid Road. So, that was formative. And when I first moved to Boston after college, I wound up going to college at UMass Amherst and moving to Boston afterwards. One of the first things I got involved in was a roving homeless encampment that lasted about 4 months and was camped out on the steps of City Hall for about 3 months. And I sort of became their unofficial organizer, helping these homeless folks do this protest encampment. And I think that was what really hooked me, because in doing that, I sort of saw the best and the worst of what people were capable of. And it was very, very inspiring and made me want to really dig in. And it's in homeless organizing. I've always seen homeless folks as, kind of the canary in the coal mine for the rest of us in terms of what's going on in the economy and people's economic vulnerability. And that being an issue that connects to everything else. So, it's a good starting point for organizing. And these are the folks who are really in the most desperate situation, and the stakes are high for them.
All right. We've got multiple events coming up this next week that are all important. And one of them is the count, the overnight count.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, every year there is a one-night count, and it is the measure by which we really see whether we're succeeding or failing in ending homelessness. And they take place throughout the nation. And this last week of January, the federal government has mandated that that's when the counts take place, which when they first decided that's when it would happen, other localities, including Seattle, were more reasonably doing it either in the fall or the spring. And we, of course, saw an immediate reduction in the numbers of homeless people when they moved it to statistically one of the coldest weeks of the year. But, this is when we've been doing it for a number of years now. And last year, about 800 people organized by the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness fanned out throughout King County. They're deployed through, these grids. And they physically go out and count the number of folks they see that are literally on the street after the shelters are filled between 2 and 5 in the morning. And last year they found 2,736 folks out there after the shelters were filled. And that was an increase over the previous year. I believe it's the highest count we've ever seen. So, it's a big deal. And the last year we did this for the first time. We're going to do it again this year. Real Change is setting up a gong in Westlake Park, and between 10 and 2, we are going to organize people into 5-minute shifts to ring that gong once for every person counted outside. When we did it last year, it took about 4 hours, and we invited people like city council members, governing board members, and the committee to end homelessness, people from the faith community, homeless people, to take turns at ringing that gong and just to have a sort of public declaration that these kinds of numbers are unacceptable, and we need to do more to get that number down and get people inside.
You said the number is after the shelters have been filled. How many people do the shelters accommodate?
About 6,000 people. And, when you look at the 10-year plan to end homelessness, the year after the plan officially began, the plan officially began in 2005. 2006 was first full year of the plan. And you look at that count, and we saw about 6,000 people that were in emergency shelter and transitional housing in King County. And there were about 2,000 people that were literally counted on the street after the shelters are filled. So here we are. The plan was started in 2005. We're coming into 2014, and we still have more than 6,000 people in emergency shelter and transitional housing. That number really hasn't changed. And the number of people that are literally on the street after the shelters are filled has gone up by nearly 1,000 people. So we're clearly not ending homelessness.
And do you have a sense for how many people are not being counted during the count? Obviously you can't see everybody.
Nobody really knows that, the whole point when you're out there and you're vulnerable, and you're trying to find a safe place to sleep, is to not be visible. So we, of course, know that we're missing people, and we, of course, know that we're not touching the people that are doubled up and indoors, and in tough situations that way. So, we're not getting everybody. We know that, and it's an imperfect count. But, as people like to say, it's at least consistent in its imperfection. The count from year to year is kind of apples to apples, and it gives us a sense of whether the number outside is growing or declining.
So the local organization that's carrying out the 10-year plan in this area is the Committee to End Homelessness in King County.
Right. That's right.
And tell us how you already told us that it doesn't sound like they're doing very well, or they're successful.
They're doing a lot of good stuff. They have they had a goal of creating 9,600, I believe, and supporting that many units of housing over the 10 years. And, they are at, I think, 54% of that goal. It's considered unlikely that they're going to get to more than 60% of that goal by the end of the 10 years. They have focused mostly on chronically homeless people who have been homeless for a long time and often have mental illness or addiction that they're dealing with that's kept them on the street for a while, and they're the highest service utilizers. They've been their top priority for getting into housing, because in system terms, these are the people that are most expensive and drawing the most resources, and you get the most cost benefit to the system by getting those folks into housing. Youth and families have also been a priority. And they're actually at like 90% of their goal for creating housing for those folks. Where they're really falling short is creating housing for non-disabled homeless folks, particularly those who have been staying in shelter for a while. And this is a problem with the resources that are available. Once they target their priority populations for creating housing, there really isn't a lot left over for the other folks. So you get people who are not disabled that have been staying in shelter for 6 months to a couple of years or more, and they're not high system utilizers. They're not cycling through the emergency rooms in the jails. They're not particularly problematic or expensive. And those folks, I mean, if you are a single white guy who's a former carpenter and you have bad knees now and you can't get work and you're staying in shelter, you can languish there for years because you're just not anybody's priority. They're at like 25% of their goal for creating housing for non-disabled folks, and that's where they're really, really falling short. And the other place that they are falling unacceptably short is in creating shelter and housing for homeless families. I mean, right now, if you're a homeless family and you call the 211 emergency line, it will take 3 weeks for you to even get an appointment to assess your situation. And if you are literally on the street, you are moved to the head of the line, to those who get, the available spaces that open up. But there are about 20 spaces for shelter and housing for homeless families that open up every month, and there are about 4,000 people on the wait list. So, even when you are moved to the head of that line, it's going to take you at least 3 months as a homeless family to get into shelter, and that is clearly unacceptable, and more needs to be done. The good news there is that it's a manageable number of spots that are needed. If they created another 200 or so shelter spots for homeless families, we would have a situation where we at least don't have homeless families and children that are literally on the streets and going to places like Nicholsville to get the safety that they need. That is a doable expansion of the shelter system, but it's unclear whether there's the political will to do that.
Do you have a sense for just how much monetarily that would cost? Because 200 just doesn't seem like that much.
I don't have a sense for what that would cost.
But you mentioned Nicholsville. The tent cities are still having a tough time. There was one of them, Tent City 4, just in the nick of time scored some space in one of the state parks for the next 20 days. It's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation. There are not enough churches, I guess, that are willing to take on that commitment. And, without the additional support and resources from the city to support non-traditional solutions like tent city encampments, it's a fairly daunting commitment for a lot of churches to take on. One of the things that we tried to get passed last year was some legislation where the city would be more supportive of non-traditional solutions that meet people where they're at, like homeless encampments, and we were one vote short of getting that passed. And, we would like to see the city revisit that, because it really, I mean, the question isn't whether people are going to be staying in tents outside. People are sleeping in tents outside. Last year we counted 2,736 people outside after the shelters were filled. That's incontrovertible. The issue is whether people are going to have the relative safety and support of living in the community of a self-managed encampment, and get additional resources to help with that, or whether they're going to be camped out in isolation in green belts and places where they are less safe and more vulnerable to violence. So, I think that the city just needs to get real and recognize that, having homeless encampments that are supported by churches and by the city is, not the solution to homelessness long term, but it keeps people safe and reduces the risk that folks are at when they're out there and vulnerable.
Let's stick with the Committee to End Homelessness in King County. Do they address tent cities at all? Have they ever touched on that? That just isn't part of their big plan.
It is not part of their big plan, and this is really one of the issues with the 10-year plan is what they measure and prioritize and what they don't. And the big fight with them over the last year or so is what they are going to do to close the survival gap. They have always been focused on ending homelessness through providing additional housing and services, and the theory has been that in focusing resources on housing, the housing first model, that they create system savings and over time reduce the stress on the shelter system so that more people can move through that and the need for shelter goes down, and eventually you end homelessness. Their idea was that by the end of 2014 that homelessness would be virtually ended, that you that if you did become homeless, you would have immediate access to housing with supportive services, that stays in shelter would be shortened, and that there would be less of a need for emergency shelter, and that there would be no need for homeless encampments. And you can see that we are a long ways from that. And over the time the plan has operated, we've actually gone in the other direction. So, I think the immediate priorities are that we need to at least focus on creating the resources so that homeless families are not literally on the streets. That should be the first thing. The second thing should be focusing on those folks who are the long-term stayers in shelter that just aren't a priority, and creating the resources to move those people out of shelter faster into housing. And then looking at the non-traditional solutions, such as homeless encampments, that reduce the damage and risk of homelessness and meet people where they're at and create more safety for them. This year, when we do the Gong event, we're launching a new campaign called Outside In, and it establishes the goal of reducing the street count over the next year before we do it again in 2015 by 1,000 people. So say if we count 2,500 people on the streets this year after the shelters are filled, the goal would be to get that down to 1,500 people by next year. And that's a really audacious goal, but it's also a goal that the Committee to End Homelessness is not going to set for itself. And I think that this is really what we need to do to shift things, is to create the community pressure, to create the grassroots pressure that says these kinds of numbers are just simply unacceptable, and we're going to lean on the electeds to put the kind of resources behind these services that we really need to make a difference. It just simply has to be a bigger priority than it is right now. The kind of what I think of as the mantra of inaction is, Seattle and King County. Seattle spends $33 million a year on housing and homelessness. We have a 10-year plan. It's working. Housing is the answer to homelessness, not shelter in tent cities. Nobody should live in a tent. I mean, I think that completely discounts the reality of what's going on out there and the level of emergency that we have. And, in relative terms, $33 million a year is not that much. I think the parks budget is like $150 million. We probably are going to spend way more than $33 million on, I'm just pulling this out of my butt, but I think, a week of cost overruns in the tunnel is probably going to come to about that. So, it's about relative priorities and what matters, and we've just got to put more muscle behind this.
So there's a new director at the Committee to End Homelessness in King County. How does he look so far, and what if you were in that position, what would you be doing?
If I were in that position, I would be, prone and curled up into a sort of a fetal position, but fortunately I'm not. He gets great reviews. Mark Putnam, by all reports, is a really smart guy who is very committed to these issues and has a great track record and is open to shaking things up. What remains to be seen is how much he's going to be able to do and how much wiggle room he's got. The 10-year plan is a big system, and whether one individual can, the sort of changing of the guard and the leadership can shift those priorities is an open question. I think it's going to take all of us pushing from the grassroots to shift the priorities around homelessness. And, if he is inclined to make a difference, that's what's going to allow him to provide the leadership to make the kinds of changes that need to happen. He's not going to be able to do that on his own. The Gates Foundation is not interested in challenging, the unequal distribution of wealth. And we have, deep problems that are going to be tough to shift, and a lot of entrenched interests that would rather not see that change.
Got about 2 minutes left. So CEHKC has a meeting coming up, do they not? Soon, or did I get that wrong? When are you going to be pushing your Outside In campaign?
We're going to be launching the Outside In campaign when we do the gong ringing on Friday at Westlake, and people will be hearing more about that. And our first organizing meeting for that, which I invite anybody who hears this to come to, is going to be at Real Change on February 18th at 6 o'clock, and we're going to be having monthly community meetings to involve people and grow the coalition and create the kind of pressure that we need to see. And
do you see the pressure primarily being directed towards the city itself or entities like CEHKC?
It's both. CEHKC it's a coalition that is made up of policymakers. So the mayor, for instance, is on the governing board, and so is the county executive. So when we put pressure on CEHKC, we are putting it on, electeds, big institutions, the policymakers. And that's necessary but not sufficient. It needs to be a pressure campaign on everybody who's got the power to make a difference.
All right. So talking with Tim Harris, he is founder and executive director at Real Change News. And again, the events that are coming up this week.
The big gong ringing at Westlake Park between 10 and 2. We'd love to see you there. And it will also be in Bellevue. We're extending it to Bellevue this year. It's going to be in front of the First Congregational Church there, and they're at Northeast 8th and 108th Street.
Okay, 10 and 2.
On the 24th, January 24th.
Very good. All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us again.
Always a pleasure.